This is In Focus.
You're listening to In Focus with Dave Kawada on CBS 1500.
You know, been in the news lately of all the incident that occurred with local entertainer Paula Funga at a Hawaii Food Bank fundraiser on Friday. It hit social media and a lot of news and things came up about that. But for this show, I thought it really brought to light some topics that relates to sensitivity and diversity in a way that somehow it fits into the workplace as kind of a training element that a lot of companies and organizations are bringing on into their workplace. So joining me now is the founder of People Strategies Hawaii, Kuʻulani Keohokalole. And first of all, Kuʻulani, thanks for joining us on such short notice.
Yeah, no problem. Grateful to be here.
And you know what? When I first heard about the incident, naturally, as I just mentioned, it brought to light, about in the workplace, because that event was a workplace setting, if you really think about it. It was a professional setting. And I think thinking about sensitivity and diversity, which I know is a training element. Let's start with some basics. What is that? What is diversity and sensitivity?
Well, so diversity is really about expanding who's represented, right? And so usually when we think about diversity, it's do we have different genders, races, ages, people with different abilities, et cetera, represented in the workplace. Sensitivity training has typically been around kind of making sure people know the right language, they don't say things that are offensive, they don't harass, those kinds of things.
And then the other thing that came to mind is that, in an earlier show, we were going into focus on a topic about implicit biases. And it was a little education for me to realize that, the way we are raised and the way we're brought up, that it's not a bad thing, but we all kind of have those implicit biases. And that also that Hawaii has that, that category of being this melting pot. And so I think me being one of the people, and I'm sure a lot of people too, we think, these kind of inclusions or prejudices or discriminations or these type of things don't really impact us here. They might be really a thing on the mainland, but it's not really here. How do you respond to that kind of thought?
Yeah, and I'm glad that you said, Dave, that, we all have biases, because I think that's the first thing we have to start with. I think sometimes what I see is that immediately puts people on a defensive and they say, well, I don't have any bias. I see everybody as equal. And so I think the first thing is recognizing that we all have bias. And, I grew up in Hawaii too. And I think you and I were talking earlier about how sometimes the jokes that we tell and, about being Hawaiian or Portuguese or whatever, like we all kind of laugh them off. But, in those things, there is bias. And the challenge becomes when the bias starts to seep into our psyche without us even really realizing it, and it starts to impact the way that we set up, for example, our education system, our healthcare systems, those kinds of things there's those inherent biases that impact people on an everyday basis.
We're talking with Kuʻulani Keohokalole, who is from People Strategies Hawaii. And let's go back a little bit. What is it that your company does? You're a consulting firm. What do you kind of consult with organizations about?
So I work with leaders in all types of organizations who really want to transform their company to be about their people. I think a lot of companies are focused on, of course, kind of the bottom line and making sure they're successful, but they run into challenges and they don't know how to lead people. I think a lot of managers get promoted because they're good at what they do, but they don't exactly know how to lead and inspire people. So my organization helps to do that.
I remember when I look back at, my working career, and you probably know these timelines a little bit better, but I would say maybe about 25 to 30 years ago, there was, this emphasis in the workplace about addressing, sexual harassment and how as a manager, as a leader of people, you need to do these certain things, based on the law, so forth and so on. Then I'm thinking, okay, now we're getting all this social injustice demonstrations and upheavals, and this occurred back in the 60s, right? I mean, it was big in the civil rights in the 60s. Now it's kind of rearing its head a little bit, obviously now with a lot of demonstrations. Cyberbullying, maybe 10 years ago, that seemed to be the next thing that, you had to address, not only in the workplace, but also, in your regular everyday lives. Is the term sensitivity and diversity, are they kind of maybe the new issues of this kind of an era, or are they maybe just a bigger umbrella term for some of these other topics to kind of fall under?
That's a really good question. So, I will say that I got my degree from UH and in ethnic studies, and that was in 2006. And I just want to just give that context because I was studying the terms diversity and racism and discrimination. I mean, that was 14 years ago. So what I see is that a lot of organizations in Hawaii are sort of behind the times on this stuff. So while we're now having these conversations about diversity more broadly, I actually think that we're kind of behind. I think that there's more that can be done than just teaching people how to be sensitive or teaching people that we need diverse opinions and things like that. I think it's about how do we sort of right some of the past wrongs and really bring about equity in terms of people's access, in terms of, justice, and looking at our communities that are have been underserved for a long time. It's kind of past having the right language already. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. We're talking with Kuʻulani Keohokalole, and unfortunately, a lot of times, right, it takes a negative situation to kind of bring an issue to the surface. And I think you kind of alluded to the fact that maybe sensitivity issues has been kind of under the surface, especially in Hawaii, because we have that, we're a melting pot and it doesn't really happen here. But it kind of suddenly brought it to the surface with what happened with Paula Funga. What could be sort of a next step, whether it be in the work environment, in the overall social environment, you think could be a next step to kind of move forward from an incident like this?
Well, I think one of the big things that leaders and organizations can do is talk about it and talk about what it means to have bias and how does it impact people. One of the things that I thought was really interesting is Slick Vic gave an apology and talked about how he grew up homeless. And, we talk about bias as something that impacts others, but it's also how are those biases inherent in us, right? So how did he maybe internalize some of that bias towards people in poverty himself? And so I think the first thing is to have the conversations and acknowledge that these things exist. I think we got to stop talking about Hawaii as this melting pot and we're so diverse. Yeah, we're diverse if you look at us compared to, let's say, Utah or Arkansas, but it goes beyond diversity to really, are we including people? Are we, ensuring that access is there? Are we advocating for people to have the same rights and things like that? So I think we've got to acknowledge these things exist. We have to educate ourselves. And I'm kind of in a mood today, so I think some of it is some of these leaders who don't know what they're doing need to get out of the way. And they need to bring in people who know what they're doing. They need to not just be about, let's diversify who's, on our staff, but who's in leadership, who's making decisions, who's affecting policies. We need to start to elevate those voices.